Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine and I have a chemistry demonstration to share with you today. We are using red cabbage juice as a pH indicator. We're going to be testing 6 different substances to see how acidic or basic they are. The first thing I'm going to do is cut a red cabbage in half and then cut it into pieces so that it can fit into my NutriBullet. So I'm putting in probably about a quarter of the cabbage with some warm to hot water. It already starts to change the color a little bit. Now this is just one method of doing an indicator. You can also boil your cabbage for about 10 minutes and extract the juice. We're just going to blend it and strain it. So this is a quick method. We're going to strain it all out. We want to save that juice. Now this works best if you use it right away. I did keep our juice and do it after a few days, but it did not work as well as an indicator, so you want to use it within a day. I'm adding about 15 milliliters of the juice to each of these test tubes, and I've labeled the test tubes with the different substances we're going to test, starting with a lemon. I juiced half a lemon, and then I'm using a pipette, so maybe about 10 to 20 drops is all you need. And I'm putting it in, and immediately you can tell that the color is changing to this beautiful pink color. And the more lemon juice you add, the more dramatic it's going to be, and the quicker it's going to change the color. So I've added maybe a total of like 15 to 20 drops. Next, we're going to move on to our vinegar, and I'm going to add a little bit to a dish so that way I can pipette it out into our test tube. And again, starting with about 10 drops or so. I noticed that with the vinegar, even though it immediately changed color, because I'm just dropping it in, the vinegar sort of stays on top. It doesn't mix the same way the lemon juice did. Next up is bleach, and again adding a little bit to a jar and then piping it in. Immediately it turns this beautiful deep blue-green color, and then it starts to turn clear, a little bit sort of milky white yellow. That was a really cool one to see. Next up is ammonia, and we are using Windex, which does have a blue tint to it. And so immediately it turns this beautiful, almost like mermaid color. It's like this teal with some blue. It was really beautiful. Next up is lye, and you have to be careful when handling lye. I've got my gloves and my goggles for all of it, but especially for the lye. It turns a really deep green color. There's a little bit of blue mixed in, and where the lye sort of rested at the bottom, it's sort of orange, and the longer it stays in there, the more it's going to discolor all of it. So you have all of the colors with this one. It was very beautiful. The last one is baking soda, and I'm just going to add maybe 1/8 of a teaspoon in, and immediately it starts to turn blue. And this is a really beautiful color. It stays blue the entire time, really different than the other ones. Really enjoyed doing this. It was simple. The cleanup was pretty simple as well. You just need to dilute all of them before you put it down the drain. This is the book where we got the inspiration for this chemistry demonstration. This is called Chemistry the Waldorf Way. So we've been using this book for our chemistry main lesson block, as well as this book, Chemistry by Live Education. This is a main lesson book that accompanies the other main lesson blocks for year 8. And today we're going to be using both our main lesson book as well as this lab notebook. This is a student lab notebook with carbon copy pages. And this is just so that my daughter can get used to what it would be like if she was taking a class where they required this kind of note-taking for lab work. We're going to go ahead and put part of this into the main lesson book. This is where we have all of the information and our illustrations and our lab reports. Instead of working on the chalkboard, I am working in a main lesson book, and then my daughter can copy illustrations from this. This book measures 9.5 inches by 12 inches with blank pages separated by an onion skin. You can get these main lesson books from A Child's Dream. So we're going to do both an illustration with some text as well as a lab report. So I've done this demonstration a few times, so I've got that example as well as some color pencils that we're going to need for our illustration. And I'm going to draw out our test tubes as well as the test tube holder. Now, this should be a really simple, beautiful illustration, but it does take me a little bit of time in order to get the proportions correct or the dimensions. It's sort of at an angle, but not exactly. So I erased quite a bit in trying to get it correct. And because we're working on the onion skin, I do need to be a little bit more careful. That onion skin paper is not as sturdy as the rest of the paper in this notebook, so I just don't want to erase so hard that it tears the paper. Once I get the basic setup done, then it's pretty easy going after this. I'm using a ruler just to get the test tubes looking correct. I was going to freehand it, but I'm really glad I used a ruler. It looks so much better this way. And I'm adding so many details with my pencil, especially some of the shading that's around the test tube and then in the lower well where the test tube hits the wooden holder. And I have 6 samples, but actually we did include 2 more samples. We had a couple other test tubes, and we did include 2 more samples that wasn't part of the demonstration. So we did milk as well as plaster of Paris, and both of them didn't come up as being strongly acidic or strongly basic, even though I know that milk is more on the basic side, but neither were strong enough to make the indicator change color. So I would have expected it to be just slightly blue for the milk, but it was at least informative to give it a try. Now I'm just coloring in the part of the illustration that is the test tube holder just to give it a little bit of dimension. I've gone over it with some light tan, some deeper colors. I'm just trying to make it look as true to life as possible because these illustrations are depicting our actual lab example. I do want them to be as accurate as possible. Now, whenever white is called for, I use black as a low light rather than a highlight because I did want to add some of the details on these test tubes that you would actually find on the test tubes that we have. They are Pyrex test tubes, and there is a little number on them, 9800, and so I did want to add those little details. I did this when we were working on the chalkboard, and I really liked the way the illustration turned out with all of those little details, so I wanted to be sure to add the same thing when we were doing this illustration for our main lesson book. It was a little redundant to do the same illustration in the main lesson book, considering that it was already on the chalkboard, but because we're going to be adding more content to this one, I was happy to do that. I also labeled each one so that we can keep a chart to identify all of the different solutions or the substances rather, that we tested and their pHs, which we did look up once we did our demonstration. I'm not including the 3 that are not pictured here. We did use soap, which we previously knew was acidic, but we did add soap to one of our test tubes. The thing with adding soap is that you do need to either mix it or dilute it a little bit, because when we added some drops of soap, it just rested at the bottom. And then about a day later, you could see that color change sort of going up the test tube. We also did not include milk and plaster of Paris, even though we did test those. I'm adding the final details to these test tubes. I love the way all the colors turned out. They are not in acidic order. They're just in the order that we actually tested them. And it's really interesting to see bleach because after a little while, it turns kind of cloudy, milky white. And that was a really neat one to see because it's not just a base, but it's also an oxidizer. I'm adding a few notes here regarding this part of the illustration. It's going to be separate than the lab report, but I did want some content related to this lesson on acids and bases that's separate from the lab report. Once this illustration is complete, my daughter is going to copy this into her main lesson book, but she will write an original narration. This is what it looks like so far. I really love the way that it turns out. I love illustrations that have a lot of color. This one brings me a lot of joy. So now it's on to the lab report, and I'm setting this one up similar to the last 2 that we did. Now, while I am writing this lab report into this main lesson book, my daughter is going to be using the student lab book in order to do hers. This will be her first time using a lab book in order to record this lab report, and I am insisting on it being very specific for a lab report. So we're going to be doing our title, our objective, our materials. She's going to be able to see this as an example, but she will need to fill it up on her own, especially the procedures and the observation. So what we did was we completed half of this so that she could see what the procedures were and the materials, and she included this into her lab book. Then she used the procedures that I wrote down here in order to do the lab on her own. So we've been generally doing the labs about 3 times. One, I'll test it out to make sure it's okay. Once I'm doing with her, and once she's doing entirely on her own. So once she was able to see the procedure that I wrote down, she went ahead and did the entire demonstration on her own, and then she recorded her observations as she saw them. I did insist that the observations were very clear, specific, and detailed. They weren't as detailed as I wanted at first, and so then I wrote this up so she can get an idea of how detailed I want her observations to be in the future. There wasn't quite room for a conclusion, but we still managed to get the lesson portion that I wanted to on the adjoining page. So this is what the completed lab report looks like along with our illustration. I really like the way that this one turned out. I feel like it was a very good lab to indicate both our learning, our illustration, some content related to acids and bases, and of course, our lab report. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our chemistry lab. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information, as well as links to all of the resources we are using for our chemistry main lesson block. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.